Welcome back to what was once Potter's Pockets, episode 22, but as we are now starting the fourth of 7 books, we are at a middle point, a crossroads. We are now changing our names. We are pivoting. We are redefining ourselves. We are transforming. We are ourselves anime guy in this way. We are becoming Conversations at the Leaky Cauldron. We thought it had a better feel and more captured the spirit of our endeavor here. 3 teachers at the local languishing spot, doing what we do best, sharing free associations with each other, and singing the songs that we sing. And so we're going to talk about the first 4 chapters of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire this time around. And I may drop a side lecture on the cover because it's just very interesting to me, this American cover. Very beautiful. And so we're going to talk about the Riddle House, the Scar, the Invitation, and Back to the Burrow. And before I get any farther, please let me warmly and cordially welcome my 2 esteemed guests and colleagues, Miss Sarah Miller and Mr. Wesley Schantz. Welcome back, you two.
Cheers. Howdy.
Clink, clink. Glad to be with you at the Leaky Cauldron.
Yeah, it's quite a crowd in here tonight, I gotta say.
Yeah, they make the drinks strong and sweet, and it's a combination I enjoy when keeping magical company. And so, before in the pre-show, we talked a little bit about wanting to start with Crossroads, but let's talk a little bit about the beginning here, the Riddle House. And so, Sarah, you had made a comment about the nice house gone to ruin in answer to a comment I made about sort of this character from Final Fantasy VII being a Luciferian character who was sort of a hero who experienced a fall, sort of a Cain-like or Luciferian fall. And you made a connection between that and who Tom Riddle is and this house that starts this Harry Potter book where we've seen these connections between Riddle and Harry Potter before. And so did you want to say something about that, please?
Yeah, I mean, I always think it's funny, or not funny, excuse me. I think it's worth discussing why authors choose to start their books the way they choose to start their books. Like, why begin in that way? I know I've taken like 1 or 2 creative writing classes in my life, but I've read a boatload of books, and I know that I know enough to respect craft. So, she could have started so many places, and she chooses to describe this house, and she chooses to start a novel about Harry Potter, which by the time the 4th one rolls around is super popular. She chooses to spend like 15 or so pages before she even mentions his name. And I was sort of reminded about the opening of Tennessee Williams' Streetcar Named Desire. I don't know if either of you have read that, but
yes, but long ago.
Yeah,
had this date for a long time.
Yeah, Blanche has been alive for quite some time, and I taught it for a long time at my old school, and we always spent a class period looking at the way the house is described and figuring out ways in which the house sort of represents the people who live in it. It's a play, so of course the set and how it's described is very intentional on the part of the playwright. But if we look at the opening of the Riddle House, it's this really proud home. I mean, enough to have a paid gardener, and but its windows have been boarded, tiles are missing from its roof, ivy spreading unchecked over its face. Once a fine-looking manor, and easily the largest and grandest building for miles around, the Riddle House was now damp, derelict, and unoccupied. And I'm sort of reminded of a couple things. The first thing I wrote on the side of the paragraph here was metaphor, ? But that, in a lot of fantasy literature, like high fantasy or epic fantasy, evil is this like creating force, this poisonous, parasitic, seemingly a being, or a being without form, or, you know, it travels kind of and poisons things like the Turkish delight or the voice of Saruman or whatever. And that's what I was reminded of when I read the phrase, the ivy spreading unchecked. And then just to know, like, by the end of the chapter, what Voldemort looks like, and how far the mighty have fallen, so to speak. And, you know, to like pull a phrase from Ollivander, like, he did great things, terrible, yes, but great. Like, he was great once, highly skilled, well-known, and like fallen into disrepair. And I just thought that's interesting. I think houses are always metaphors, or not always, but very often metaphors in like Gothic literature, like the House of Usher and all of that. Anyway,
Right.
that's what I was thinking.
Oh yeah, I really like the connection there to how this book sort of fits into the literature, you know, like the fantasy, the Gothic, the English novel, you know. I mean, this one, like you mentioned, its size, its scope, it's clearly got certain pretension in the first three books, but now she's really just like flexing her writing muscles because she's got kind of carte blanche at this point, right? And so the way she starts it out is with the house, but also the village itself, right? And the kind of rumors that surround the house. It's called the Riddle House, and it's called Creepy. And I think, you know, both of those refer to what happened there, which is, right, lying there with their eyes wide open, cold as ice, still in their dinner things. It's like the riddle, or one aspect of it is like, how does that happen? How do three apparently healthy people just drop dead? And then that's sort of like what the village discusses, and it's like this problem that they pose to themselves, and they're like bound to find the simplest solution, right? And so they all focus on the gardener, and of course there's a whole metaphorical resonance to that right away too, right? The gardener did it. He's the one that we're going to blame and scapegoat. And by the end of the chapter, we see that he's like a very brave guy. Like he's terrified, and yet he's trying to still do the right thing. And we get this further riddle, I guess, of how could this being in the chair be more terrifying than an enormous, you know, snake that slithers past. It's like the riddle shifts from like murder, because now we sort of understand at least a little bit about that, to like the fear and the being that's behind the murder is I think where I'm left, like, really my mind can't even really conceptualize what such a horrifying thing would be.
Yeah.
But it's a great opening.
Sort of like the image over the first chapter in the American edition, which is the snake. And so it's like the physical embodiment versus the principle of evil that it represents, right? That which lies beyond it and is so much more than it that you can even conceptualize. Sort of the power of villains like it that don't show their true form. But
don't even mention it.
I know, it's very scary. So yeah, and I was thinking about that in context of Lord Voldemort, and how Lord Voldemort for all of us is potentially that which we refuse to face, which causes us absolute terror because of it in our life. And insofar as that which you refuse to face, that's Lord Voldemort. But I wanted to ask you what you thought about the fact that this book begins with a dream, and to what extent that's a commentary on the reading of literature and of itself, and insofar as this is a dream which directly connects Harry Potter to Lord Voldemort, which connects Lord Voldemort even more strongly to our story. To what extent is this story suggesting that it is itself a dream, which is a gathering space for us to bring us all closer to together, and that I don't know that is sort of a fusion of light and dark magic or something like that, in the same way that Harry embodies the hero and Voldemort the villain, and yet they share this very deep connection. As if Voldemort is that which is necessary to produce somebody as great as Harry. The hero requires an adversary or something. I don't know. What do you make of this dream?
I like that interpretation a lot. I mean, I think when I see the scar, just by itself, that makes me think of the great scene in the Odyssey where
Yes.
Odysseus's identity is revealed by his scar, and
Yes.
we get that plunge into his past as a kid, hunting the boar and getting gashed by it, or so I find it interesting too, the way that Harry gets only sort of fragments of the dream, and we see the whole dream. And so what's that about? Or we see a lot of the dream, I guess we should say. We never see everything, because the book is, as long as it is, it leaves out plenty of things. So I just think it's cool, though, that Harry, he has these scattered images, but he can't really piece them together.
Yes. Yeah, and it also reminds me, just to throw this in there then, the scar is mentioned again in Dante when he looks down from Canto 26 of the Paradiso back down to, reflecting back to his experience in Canto 26 of the Inferno of Ulysses, though indirectly, he sees the space of the journey of Ulysses as a scar on the world. And so, also in the Purgatorio, Dante had 3 dreams, and also sleeping and the function of dream functions in Homer as well. In fact, Agamemnon has a dream in book 2, and Odysseus often falls asleep, and that's when the action is. So dreams have a major epic role, and so it's almost as if in taking on this middle book, it's as if she's starting to show her hands. She has this tremendous length, this tremendous introduction, these epic motifs of using dream, and the scar also just evokes, these several epic books as well. It's almost as if she's taking her place in history, and it's a much bigger and grander place simply than popular fantasy novel that makes lots of money. Right.
Yeah, I mean, something Wes brought up was that she starts with the town, which I think is interesting too, because aside from the Dursleys and what's her name, Aunt Marge, which I guess she's a Dursley too, we really don't have much of a sense of the Muggle world, and we also don't have much of a sense of history and how magic functions and has functioned or not, as the case may be, in relationship to the wider British world. And that seems like a significant move for her to go so far back in time, and to also feature characters who are not magic, right? So I'm not really sure what else to say about that, but that seems like another thing that's different about the book. And
Okay.
and maybe that not just pulling on the strings of, say, epic literature that she's referring to. And we've been talking about this for a while, that and that's part of the thrust of our conversation, is regularly the ways in which classic literature finds its way into the first 3 books. But as you mentioned, Wes, this is also about English literature, and the history of the English countryside novel or the countryside village, and the way that those social hierarchies are reflected in the story, I think is also significant. There's a class dynamic that is in the opening chapter. There's a class dynamic in the 4th chapter about Ferraris and fancy outfits. And that's a reoccurring theme in a lot of British literature. So as much as she's anchoring herself in the tradition of the ancient or the classic, she's also pulling on a lot of strings from her more recent forefathers and foremothers, you know?
Yeah. Well, I have sort of a dark question for you, Wes. And maybe it's just conspiracy, maybe not though. Do you think that Harry has this dream at this particular time during the summer when he is at home with his family after having first learned sort of about the darknesses in the wizarding world, both of the uses of dark magic and of betrayal? That potentially this dream could represent sort of his unconscious thoughts and feelings towards the Dursleys. In fact, they are in tremendous danger while he is there. And that insofar as he is connected to Tom Riddle, he is connected to Tom Riddle's decisions. That it is, in fact, there's decisions that have so far distinguished them, but that's going to be an ongoing battle with him for the rest of his life as a sort of wizard with these powers who has been mistreated by these muggles. Is he going to thus mistreat them when he becomes more powerful than they? And is that something that's at play here?
I think that's fair, because the Harry Potter that we meet here is like a slightly more sarcastic Harry Potter. Like, he also has these sort of this interior monologue thing going on where he imagines what people would react with if he like tried to tell them about his scar hurting, and he's sort of like dismissive of it. He's definitely no more empathetic towards the Dursleys than he ever was. You know, he sort of scorns them more than he fears them at this point, and that's definitely like a Voldemortian turn, I guess, like going down the path of despising the people that you had feared, or something, like as you gain power and they are revealed as equally vulnerable as you. That's pretty, I think, a legit way to read this, and I think that makes the character a lot more interesting, frankly. Like, if he's just a hero and just sort of swoops in and saves the day and this and that, you know, that's okay. We've seen that 3 books in running. Okay, so we've got to sort of deepen Harry's character a bit, give him this horrible dream, have him have this kind of psychic connection to the ultimate Dark Lord, and of course he saved Pettigrew's life, and we're told that sort of establishes a kind of link between them as well. So that's cool. And then of course the person he looks up to the most in the world, right, who he realizes that's the person he should tell this story to, he's still separated from that person. So there's that like additional kind of weight on his heart at this point, and he sort of leaves out, even when he finally decides to tell him like something weird happened, he leaves out the thing about the dream, and he's still doing, you know, that thing we notice from time to time, that Harry will just like not disclose and doesn't like seem to trust, or seems afraid of trusting, you know, and that makes a lot of sense, and he's like very sympathetic in that way.
Yeah, and I wanna bring up, it's like we are reestablishing our connection with him, as in the way that you reestablish your connection with like a movie or a theater. Like there's a time of transition between your outside world and you taking on the frame of reference of the hero. But I want to suggest 2 lines we could go down here just because they're both very interesting. I want to talk about either the 2 messengers who are not like the archetypal Hedwig messenger who is so dignified, so the pigwidgeon that we meet, as well as the sort of paradise birds, the birds from the tropical birds that, again, Hedwig does not approve of, and what that means. But also we get another eruption of the magical world into the Dursleys' household. There seem always to be every summer at least one major eruption. And sort of what that means, and the joke that's played by Fred on the boys, and the fact that the dad knew it was Fred and not George. I guess he could just recognize him. But also sort of him keeping his hand on Harry's shoulder and insisting that the Dursleys say goodbye to him, to treat him with that dignity, and whether that's sort of a key to Ron's and the Weasleys' characters and why we love them so much, that they treat everybody with dignity. And so, so those 2 paths, or another one.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I always love the scene where they're talking to each other through a wall, and they can't quite figure out how to get to Privet Drive. Like, yes, there's this explosion, of course, but it's not without like a lot of, I don't know. I don't know what I'm trying to say. I guess what I'm trying to say is like
There was a preamble.
Yeah, no, I'm no. When the magical world like finds its way into Privet Drive, it's not with finesse,
Yes,
shall we say?
that's
like,
right. That's right.
You know
Deny it.
that there's a version of like imperfection in the wizarding world. You know, for all of their powers and their capacity to, oh, we can travel through fire and we use owl posts, and it seems like, well, their lives would be just so much more efficient, or their lives would just be so much more convenient or comfortable. There's a degree to which we're reminded that, like, actually they're just different, you know, like the way that the townspeople talk about Frank and like, oh yeah, he never wanted to hang out with us at the pub. Well, someone, just one lone person pipes up and says, he had a hard time in the war and he's just a quiet fellow. Like in both Little Hangleton and in Privet Drive, or Little Whinging, whatever the town is called, there's like a unwillingness to accept people who are different, and like difference is seen as imperfect, and a desire to see the other as imperfect drives one to maybe try to appear perfect yourself. Look at like what Mr. Dursley does. He wears his like best suit in the world. They try to have like this perfect little family portrait with Dudley sitting in a chair and Vernon reading his newspaper as the Weasleys arrive. Like, there's just all of these pretenses, and I love how Mr. Weasley is like trying to make conversation. Like, oh, do you use like electricity, or do you I collect batteries? And I guess, I don't know, I think that's super endearing, that they don't seem as a family to resent difference. Like, and I think that's pretty significant. Like, they're all so diverse as kids, and I don't know. I think that's why I like them, is that anybody is welcome, and not just welcome like, oh, come as you are, do your thing, we won't bother you, but everybody is like a potential family member, and that's I think that's why I like them. I don't know if that makes sense, if that responds to your question, Alex. But
okay, it does, and I just want to put another sub-thread on this that I forgot to bring up earlier, that I brought up at the end of last time, which is, why is Peter Pettigrew being called Wormtail by both Voldemort and then by the narrator, and then even later, and I think this weakens my theory that Voldemort is just being cruel with him, but strengthens another theory that this is just now how the author thinks of him, and thus we think of him, has Harry think about him as Wormtail, and then explains who he is in the story through the function of his personal memory of him, an explanation given by him of his own memory. And so even to Harry now, he has become Wormtail, and sort of what that means as well. So, Wes, I don't know if you want to respond to the first thing that we said, or the thing that came before that, actually, or that too. The gardens are rich tonight.
I'm going to do my best. Yeah. Well, so I thought it was cool, like tying together what you just said with what Sarah was saying about family members, right? That's part of what horrified Ron so much when he realized that his rat was actually this person. Like, he was a part of their family for many years, and he was sort of like handed down in the family, Scabbers, that is. And then for him to be revealed as Wormtail, right? This friend who betrayed Harry's parents, then that really throws a wrench into the family dynamic. It's a bit awkward, right? And so that's like a huge question in these books. I think as I'm reading them now and thinking about it, right, like what is a family supposed to be like, and how does one grow into a family, or um, what are the kinds of rules, and how much mercy can be granted when the rules are broken, and maybe even very profound ways, like through betrayal. Um, those are the sorts of things that Rowling seems really interested in, and everyone sort of feels that. Like, I think as a reader, you feel sympathy for the Dursleys even here, because yeah, they are trying really hard in the way that they understand to like present themselves as this good family, and you know, Aunt Petunia now is trying to get them to be on a diet, and they keep breaking the diet behind her back in these like pathetic ways, right? Like stealing each other's grapefruit chunk. It's sad, and it's like hilarious at the same time, and it's just like very familiar. It's very family like. You get the mention of the PlayStation, it gets thrown out the window, and the games that Dudley's playing on that, right? And so it's like I could see that, right? Like Harry is Dudley's sibling, as much as he might not want it to be the case. They do have that relationship, and I think to the point about the birds, I suppose something similar is going on there, where you've got this sort of like mini of Hedwig, Pigwidgeon, which is an interesting name. I think it comes from some other fantasy or fairy tale thing where it's like a kind of little fairy that minces around or something. That's, at least if I'm remembering right, how Tolkien talks about it in his fairy stories essay. And then like the glamorous birds that make you think of palm trees and white sands. Well, everyone's got that family member, I think, too, right? That they sort of resent for being so carefree and living somewhere nice and warm while they're suffering through the cold.
Well, and that's something I wanted to ask about this book. So something we thought we noticed in the books before was sort of the rising dark tone, and to what extent in this book we start to see that becoming more manifest in a more articulated or embodied fashion, even early on in the story. And so, yeah, I don't know if I can bridge that connection quite yet.
What about the name of the pub that they're at is the Hanged Man?
Right.
That's
yes.
That's giveaway, right?
Right. And I mean, so what's emphasized? So, I mean, and well, let's think about the name itself, the Goblet of Fire, and the connection to wizards and witches. Though it is perfectly possible that a Goblet of Fire could be a source of illumination, or could be sort of a place of sort of alchemical rebirth, just to get back to our theme of crossroads and transformation. It seems as if there's also the connection of fire as a purifying or agent used by fascists, either in Germany in the 20th century or puritanical America in Salem, based on weird reading of practices described by Dante. But it does seem, and I think we will see this later on, so I'm not sure if I'm reading this into the story from what's there or what will be there, that the darkness present in the wizarding world, and thus in every world, making this fantasy world sort of just as heavy and thus real or weighty or a place where a moral holiday could not be taken. Sort of the anchor hits the ground, or hits the waves here. It's like the dark mark. This is a place where evil happens too. This is a place where your decisions matter. this too is a place where there is a gambit between good and evil, and your choices will define the reality in which you live.
I think that's interesting because, so one thing I noticed is sort of related to what you were saying, Alex, the idea of choices, and how, in a world of many potentials where, there are forces of good and there are specters of evil, your choices are extremely important. Your choices, as Dumbledore says, are ultimately what define you. And I think it's in chapter 4, at the beginning of chapter 4, I'm flipping to find it right now, where he is packing. And he is furiously scurrying around his house to pick up his most prized possessions. The invisibility cloak he had inherited from his father, the broomstick he had gotten from Sirius, and the enchanted map of Hogwarts he had been given by Fred and George Weasley last year. I'm really intrigued by what those three have in common, and like what that says about Harry and what that says about choices. Like, to me, one thing that they all have in common is that they are like methods of skirting rules, or like time, I don't know, methods of skirting space. The broomstick gets you far, far away. Really quickly, the invisibility cloak allows Harry and Ron and Hermione at different times to just completely blow off the rules that are intentionally designed for their protection. And that seems like a significant trio to me, given what you're talking about choice and, the responsibility that comes with it, because we've all seen him abdicate that responsibility using those items in some kind of combination.
Yeah, I'm just now thinking about what those three items mean. Wes, what did you take on that?
Yeah, I thought about it a little different. Like when you're saying about the Goblet of Fire, if I remember right, Harry doesn't really want to be in the tournament at all, right? He doesn't intentionally do that. And these things are also these are all gifts. Each of these things is given to him, not by any grace of his own, but by the grace of the givers. And they're sort of like looking out for him. And I think that's kind of interesting because all of your free will and your choices are sort of like conditioned within a space that you didn't create. And so a lot of free will involves like how you deal with these situations that sort of fall upon you and that you encounter unwillingly, and that's sort of like what makes Harry Potter and what makes Voldemort is that they approach those in really different ways.
Yeah, and I mean, just the fact that he prizes these possessions, and that these are possessions that he received from friends because they were his friends, or they had some relation of affection to him, as opposed to people whose cold, dead hands he's prying them out from, right? Or whose knowledge he has like absorbed their brains or destroyed their brains or their bodies in order to acquire, right? It is just as much the item as his connection to the person who gives him the item that gives it its special significance, which is perhaps what makes Voldemort so cold, but also, like Sephiroth so cold, and just in the Final Fantasy reference too, just to bring back the notion of fantasy, and just how interesting it is if a listener listens to this segment and the Final Fantasy one, that these are both manifestations of the same sort of fantasy seed that was first planted by J.R.R. Tolkien.
Right, but I would just say that, like, I'm not sure we're disagreeing at all. I'm just saying that, I also think the thing that these three things have in common is that they're given to him by people that he looks up to. Like his most prized possessions are not gifts from his friends.
Right.
They're gifts from people who he, you know, he's not talking about like the nice broomstick kit that Hermione got him. He's talking, his three most prized possessions are things that like come from people who he, I don't know, who he maybe envies is the wrong word, but who he wants to impress. And I don't know, as a combination, they all feature like a bit of recklessness or a bit of not deception is the wrong word, but like escape, like liberty, but taking liberty, not necessarily liberty for something, like liberty from something. I don't know if that makes sense.
All right, how about this? I think that you said it better, that in these people representing an ideal towards which Harry strives, these gifts are like a manifestation of the skills you acquire in attempting to embody a noble ideal and what the sort of benefit is. So if you try and be like the tricksters, Fred and George, you explore more of the known territory, the Hogwarts, and you learn more about yourself and human nature because of that. And that's something that the Marauders map might help to represent, like one, knowing one's orientation within known territory, and other people's too, because of one's ability to skirt the rules. And, you know, something similar with Sirius and also his father with the invisibility cloak. And so, because it also strikes me that these are the major gifts that he has, right? Like the broom detailing kit is a great gift, but the invisibility cloak is like a divine gift. Nobody else has it. It's unique. Same with his broomstick at this point. The firebolt, unique. And the same with the enchanted map of Hogwarts. I mean, these are like angels that he has. And perhaps that's actually part of what it's supposed to represent. These are sort of like messages from the past that give you power if you harness them or something like that. I'm not sure. What do y'all think?
I do. I definitely. Oh no, I was just going to say that I agree that that these are gifts of aspiration. I think is what you said. That these are gifts that he has to learn to use in becoming. I'm not sure if that's sort of what you were suggesting. That like the various traits, the broom for being a good seeker, and for the other ways that he uses the broom, which are I know we haven't seen much of, but yeah. And then like the map for maybe knowledge or insight. Maybe it's also for you know, the good kind of deception or trickery, strategy, and the invisibility cloak. Yeah, I mean, eventually we'll find out how important that is to who he is as, like, you know, the son of James Potter, the marked one, the chosen one. Like, that invisibility cloak is central. And I do think that you're right, that they are like gifts that he has to learn to use well, because like he can easily abuse them, right? And so a really big part of that, like to Wes's point, is like choosing what to do with what you're given. Not everybody's given the same gift. So, you know, yeah, that's all.
That's excellent. Yeah, Wes.
I really like that, and just thinking about like the role of magic too. That's obviously like the greatest gift that he's given, is his magical ability and the magical protection that infuses him, and in some ways that's like the greatest mark of what you might call a metaphorical like class distinction within the books, right? Is like between the magical and the muggle. And Harry's raised as if he's nothing special, right? But that only serves to like make him that much more amazing, as I think we talked about, you know, back in the first book. So that even the thing that seemed like he was being deprived, like turned out to be a gift for him. Like that's the
Right.
kind of charmed life that he, well, one way to look at it at least. And I think there's something really cool going on here too, where the children, the minors are not allowed to use magic outside of school, but Mr. Weasley, of course, is, and so he's sort of like in charge, obviously. But the twins get around that because they slip Dudley a candy that causes his tongue to like quadruple in size or whatever, and like or maybe more than that, right? It's like it becomes this kind of like grotesque appendage, and
I
Mr.
think it becomes 4 feet long before.
There we go. Okay.
Uh-huh.
Mr. Weasley is left to clean up the mess, right? So I think that's another sort of funny image of that sort of theme of responsibility, of what comes with the gift, of ways to use and misuse the gifts that you're given, right, for various effects. He's obviously like really mad at them because he wanted to have this great like chance to see Muggles in their natural habitat or whatever, but at the same time, in a way, he's like seeing exactly the right example of what Harry's been through all these years, and like what the Dursleys are like, and of course what his own family, what they're all about too.
Yeah, and it's interesting too to what extent they're both liminal figures, right? But there's still just a major gap between them. Though Weasley is a poor man and thus making him a common man, he who actually works for the Department of Muggles and thus should know the most about Muggles, there's still so much when he comes into a Muggle household that is unfamiliar to him. Like, he doesn't even know what the word electric is, which would be laughable to us as Muggles. And these Dursleys, even though they pretend to be all plain, do clearly have a magical son who has done magical things in the past and is actually in their care because of magical evil deeds. So they're actually way more in the know than most people, oddly enough, which, maybe explains sort of their crazy behavior. If you look at them as sort of like a traumatized family by like a terrible event or something like that, and how they forever live in fear afterwards of the potential for chaos re-erupting in their life. And that's what Harry represents. If you ever wanted to be kind. Yeah, go on.
I was just going to say, I think it's interesting what you just pointed out that like the Dursleys, maybe more than most families, have a remarkable connection to magic, and yet they eschew it at every turn. Like, we are normal. He didn't even like that there were a bunch of stamps on the letter. And I mean, what's funny, what that reminded me of is one of my friends just got married, and her wedding invitation was gorgeous. It was a little heavier. It was like a mobile, like the an Alexander Calder type piece. And so there were a lot of moving parts. So it was heavier, and they had put a bunch of really small value stamps on the piece, on the envelope, to represent parts of who they were as a couple. So there was like a baseball stamp worth 5 cents, and there was like a Notre Dame stamp worth 10 cents. And there was like a San Francisco stamp worth 12 cents or something like that. And anyway, when it was described, I thought back to the wedding invitation, and that, like, how weird that looked to me. And I live in the real world. But anyway, that's beside the point. The point is, I think it's interesting that Mr. Weasley like leans in to what he doesn't know, and that the Dursleys lean out from what what little they do. That like their little knowledge scares the shit out of them, whereas for Mr. Weasley, sorry, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, and I just want to, I think you made a great point there, because I think what you're laying out is that there are two fundamental attitudes towards life. That there's the one where you accept what you don't know is there, and then you try to sort it out in a conscious way, like Mr. Weasley, or you refuse to acknowledge what even you do know, and then it just erupts in on you and causes chaos, and you have to hope some external thing helps you out.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly what I meant. I mean, you said it better than I did, but
no, I got to hear you say it, and that's what I said based on it. So that I thought was, no, I think that's excellent, because they are like the same family in reverse in a way, right? And one is so hateful with terrible results, and one is so beautiful and wonderful. And they both have plenty, but in different ways. Like, Vernon Dursley is doing great. He can afford to give a lot to his family. And well, even though the Weasleys don't have a ton of money, they have just a ton of all the right stuff, like, which I guess I would just characterize as appropriate love and family, or just like a really great and nurturing environment in which to exist. They feel wealthy. Well, so I guess that's something you could debate, whether both of them do have wealth and whether it is the same sort of wealth. And so whether they are the same sort of family in reverse. But do we want to conclude on that, or something else?
What do you think, Wes? Something else you wanted to talk about?
I thought this was like a really interesting way to open the story. I like that we got to talk about the opening dream a little bit. Like, I hadn't thought about it in those terms at all. But I guess I would be interested if we could, like, we had been doing this a while ago when we sort of started the project, if we could find a way to have like a few sections of the program, like each week, that are sort of followed through. I don't know what exactly that should look like, but in the interests of like formalizing, right? Or like, I don't know if that's quite the right word for it, but establishing some recurring ideas that we're like careful to come back to, because I have a hard time remembering a lot of times what we've said in the previous episodes and things like that. But so this one, maybe for this book, it should be to do with fires, and we can just like keep an eye out on fire imagery or something like that. I don't know if that will be, I don't know if that'll be like enough. But
okay, now I have a couple.
Like, so it's like the transformational aspect of it, I think, is brought out here.
Okay, and what about also riddles? Because that's explicitly stated in the first riddles which we encounter, and how those house our consciousness. Fire and riddles, and because I've always thought, and so this can be a hypothesis then that we test, if the other is a theme, that riddles are a major component to our fascination in these stories. And, well, the other one I wanted to suggest was just, snake imagery. Because that's something that we encounter very frequently, and even in the very first image, and the very first dream in this. I guess those are just themes, but we were also suggesting segments too, right? And so, I guess what I wanted to say is, if the listeners wanted to leave a comment or give us a shout out on Anchor, that would be really interesting too. I think we would all be open to suggestions like that. But we're now using the Slack software too. I guess over this next week we could do some homework and set up some new segments and produce our new show with some new finesses, some new sophisticated.
Can I suggest one more pattern for us to look for?
Yes, absolutely.
And that's something I think I already brought it up when we were sort of dancing around the idea of like the differences between the two families, the differences in classes, and I think that something we should look for is the way that difference between individuals and groups of people plays out, like particularly fear of difference and what is involved with like transcending difference, and or perhaps like making meaning of it. I know a few pods ago, maybe like a couple months ago even, we talked about the way in which like the emerging modern Britain seems to be like an image or a reality or a backdrop against which the story is told. And I think it might be worth just exploring like how does the novel or the series deal with or what does it have to say about diversity, but not in like the stereotypical kind of buzzword sense, but like the genuine like the way in which we like make use out of what is different about us for the sake of perhaps what we share. I mean that'd be a worthwhile theme to look for. Who struggles with that? Who doesn't? Why? Etc.
Right on.
Yeah,
Definitely.
be part of the beauty of the rainbow is the diversity of its parts and the equality of their distribution. And it seems like every child even knows that, so it's a fundamental. So that's great. That's great. And it's interesting to what extent we are looking for those fundamental themes in these books, right? Because this is something you read when you're young, when you're an adolescent, and during a formative period. And so it helps you to form the ethics that you'll have for the majority of your life, because it's like, to what extent do you even read your books in high school and in college? And how many books did you even read? And how many books did you read last year? And like, do you go to church for your morality? And it's like, what are the actual stories that have helped you to form your character? And for a lot of people, these ones are big, like just like Star Wars, just like J.R.R. Tolkien. And so I think, just to be really real about it in the distribution of these stories, it's very important to know and to try and articulate what it is they're saying, because probably they've had an effect on your character if you've read them or even watched them, or possibly even if you just know about them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's like subconscious moral development that happens when you read. I mean, I know studies have shown, particularly like ed psych studies have shown that there is genuine moral advancement or development visible in kids, specifically with this series. I'll send around that article. I'm not sure I've shared that with you all, but or like that series of articles. Maybe I don't know when I read them last, but that's just a worthwhile investigation, I think. And I think it's interesting that they're doing research on kids with this book to see like who, to what degree does reading this and talking about it, maybe not even talking about it, just absorbing the story, to what degree does it like form who you are? Or, the way you see the world, the way you see others. That was particularly where the research that I saw was focused. Like, how does this affect young people? Not young people, but like young kids. How does this affect how they see people who are not like them? Which I think is certainly a worthwhile question in an increasingly global world where everybody seems interconnected, and their diversity is even more visible as a consequence.
Where everybody can throw their name in the fire. And so
that's right.
What do y'all think about 5, 6, 7, and 8 for next time? It's about, I think, 60 pages, a little longer than usual, but the Quidditch World Cup just seems impossible to stop before.
Yeah, we heard a little bit about it, so it would be cool to get to see that. And incorporate it. Yeah, sounds good.
I really appreciate that she does a world level event like that, and really twice in the course of the book. It's again, I think that's, I don't know, I don't want to get into it now, but something like a bigger, larger global appeal, something powerful. And it's Well, it's something I love about this book, the magnificence of it. And so, well, y'all, until after Thanksgiving, happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Yeah, you too. Safe travels.
And next time, something new. Clank.
Clink, clink. See ya.
Bye.